you're one of the leaders in the measurement space. We met each other a number of years ago when you were at TRA. Before that, in the early days, you were back in Arbitron. It's fascinating to me how everything old is new again, how people get so into the new and funky stuff that they forget about what the basics are. And now the basics are back. But before we even get to that, I'd love it if you could tell me about your journey. Your career path is unbelievable.
In order to condense those many years into the shortest space, I started at the agencies. I got a terrific amount of training from fantastic people at Gray Advertising and Interpublic. And then when I got to Arbitron, I invented the ADI, which became the DMA. And the whole point of it, in my mind, was back then we had warehouse withdrawal data as a proxy for sales data. You couldn't line it up with the GRPs or TRPs or reach frequency you were delivering market by market because, first of all, there were transshipments from one distribution hub to another. But the big problem was we didn't have a way of dividing up the United States into a geographic grid system where each county would only be in one market because the TV signals overlapped in between markets. So you had a whole lot of overlapping Venn diagrams, but you didn't have any grid. And until you had a grid, you couldn't compare sales and stimuli. For a long, long time, most of the time I've been in the business, the whole advertising industry was marching to a drummer, Stuart Colley, who wrote a book back in the 60s called Defining Advertising Goals for Measured Advertising Results, which basically said we will never be able to measure the sales effects of advertising except direct response. And so stop trying and let's all try to get essentially what's today called return on objectives. And I believed it because everyone I respected believed it. And then much later, when I was at Next Century Media, and we did the first TRA type experiments with Polk data, and I saw the opportunity for frequent shopper card data to be used, and then that went off and did TRA. And the rest, I think, is more familiar to you. So that's kind of a condensation.
That's incredible. So you invented the DMA.
Well, I called it the ADI. And the funny thing back then, this is just a side note, but Nielsen had always been the national service measuring homes. Arbitron had been the local service and also measured viewers per viewing home, which people combined with Nielsen data nationally. So everybody had their own niche. But then Nielsen made all the sense in the world from their point of view, decided, well, why do we leave Arbitron doing this other stuff? We could do the other stuff. And so they entered the local market TV measurement business against Arbitron. And in the first year before I got there, they took away 86% share of local market business. I'm sorry, 84%. They left Arbitron with 16% weighted share of spot TV spending based on the agencies that they had taken away, essentially all of them. So when I got to Arbitron, they didn't tell me this before I joined, but they said, we are going out of business. So don't unpack your bags too fast. And I went around and I talked to everybody else in the industry, and I got to meet a lot of people that I didn't know, that I had heard their names and I looked up to them. And I got 4 agencies to switch back in the first year, and then a whole bunch, almost 40 the next year, because of the ADI. And then at the very last minute, before the first agency switched back, it was Ogilvy. I got a call from Ogilvy. He's now deceased, an old friend of mine, Jack Hill. And he said, Julie, he was the head, he was the media director. Julie just asked me, why are we signing this contract with Arbitron? Nielsen just said they're going to duplicate the ADI. They call it the DMA. They're going to do it. So why should we switch now? And my answer was, well, you're right. That go ahead and switch. But what'll happen is Arbitron will go out of business, and there'll never be any new thing coming out of Nielsen. Why would they? It'll just go on that way without any new things. But if you keep us around, we'll keep inventing new things. And I rattled off a few of my ideas. Ogilvy went ahead, signed the contract. Then BBDO, Benton and Bowles, and Jay Walter followed that year. And by the following year, we had recaptured 53% share of market. But anyway, that's just a story I enjoy telling. We'll probably edit it out.
No, that's incredible. For those who are listening who don't know about the history of TRA, if you could explain the basis of TRA and what it did and where it's at now.
The whole idea started with Next Century Media. So Next Century Media was the company, my 1990s company, that did the first set-top box data, the first addressable commercials, the first programmatic buying selling interface for the addressable commercials, and the first machine learning based personalized program recommender, which developed the technology we now call driver tags, which is now resident in my new startup, RMT. Since I'm a masochist, I just can't stop doing startups. At Next Century Media, the idea came to me, oh my gosh, we've got Polk data. We can compare it on a household basis. We can see when they bought the car and relate that to when they got the various ads for that car on television. Then I wanted to keep going with that. I created the idea of a company called TRA, and Charter was going to do it, and we were going to do it together. And then I met Mark Lieberman, and he said, "Well, why don't we raise money for this?" And he said, "I can do that." We got CBS as a client, and we made the Charter deal. We started to produce stuff supported by Dave Poltrak and CBS mostly. About a year into it, well, it was actually 2005 when we started, and it was later in 2007, September 2007, when we got WPP and venture funding, and we started to raise money that way. The idea was a deterministic system, essentially a replacement for Apollo. We knew that Apollo couldn't do the job with the small sample size. We also knew that around the world, every time somebody tried to do single source and they never got above like 5,000 sample size, it went out of business. They couldn't help the smaller and even medium sized brands. They could only help the bigger brands who were mostly topped out. They needed more sample size and nobody had solved it. So the idea was do single source, but don't use home barcode scanning. Use naturally occurring data, frequent shopper card data, prescription tracking data, HIPAA compliant, Polk data, the company's own CRM records for financial services and so on, so that you would have at the household level the stimuli coming in, including digital. We did digital, we did cinema, we did a lot of things. We experimented with all media types, print and so on. We were able to get the data and large samples. So we had the first samples that ran up into millions of, I mean, single source had never been above 5,000. We were doing single source at over 1 million homes. So it, made history. Next thing that happened, of course, Nielsen Catalina capitalized on that, and they stepped in and, for CPG at least, pushed back. I mean, we had gotten most of the big CPGs. We were keeping all the other business, and that was doing well. TiVo then acquired the company, and then TiVo was acquired by Rovi, and they have a different view of life and a different set of business goals and objectives. They essentially skinnied back the TRA part of the company from some 30 odd people to, I think it's fewer than 5 now. And essentially, what they're doing is selling what they were doing before there was a TRA. They were selling TiVo's own set-top box data. So they've gone back to doing that. So TRA had its 15 minutes in the sun, but it also triggered a lot of other people to follow in its course, and not just Nielsen Catalina, but hundreds of companies worldwide, and in digital, thousands of companies, tens of thousands of companies worldwide are applying the same principles.
And then since then, we've gone from the world of the traditional MMM model. We've seen the birth of multi touch attribution on the digital side. We've seen the combination of those into a unified model, mixing digital and traditional media together. But there's been this rallying cry from brands that the concept of base or incrementality is not involved in those calculations, that they're taking credit for everything that goes on, whether I would have gotten those sales or not anyway. That leads me to this concept of these randomized controlled trials, which is the basis of your new startup?
Well, it was the RMT had started with two main goals in mind. One, driver tags caught on. The other one, which we called high ops, meaning hyperlocal opportunities, was all based on the idea of random controlled trials, and especially carrying them out on a local basis. And that's where the hyper local part came in. That part didn't take off as fast. Where the random control test idea next surfaced in my life was at TRA. We engaged the ARF to do what they call a research review. And a research review is a very useful process that more research companies ought to, and other companies who do research of their own design, even if they're an advertiser. Many advertisers do research of their own design. Mars, for example, has a subsidiary called Mars Catalyst that does some fine research work. Anyway, the research review ARF did was very positive and kept coming back to the idea that I kept trying to bring up with all the TRA clients, but it didn't work. And that was the idea of let's use the TRA findings, since it's observational, naturalistic research looking at historical data, coming up with hypotheses. We should then test the hypotheses with a random control trial before pulling the trigger on a big change in buying pattern or creative or whatever we learned from the looking backward research that TRA did. And everybody liked the idea, but nobody did it. And they all just they took the findings of the observational stuff and they activated based on it, which is still happening today. And the advertisers are still properly complaining, why have we dropped this? This is part of science. You know, science starts with observations and then it forms hypotheses and then it does random control trials. And we used to do random control trials as an industry. So how come we've stopped? One of the reasons was misunderstanding that you could actually depend on the looking backward research to give you perfectly incremental information if you did enough adjustments to the data. So everybody's got black box proprietary adjustments that they make to try to make the unexposed group, if there is any substantial unexposed group. Big schedules don't leave much unexposed, but trying to get the unexposed group weighted so that they're demographically and however else possible looking just like the exposed group. So you've controlled for those variables. So if you do all of that, maybe you got incrementality, but it would still be nice to know and to verify it. So for the last year or so, well, I'm skipping something. When I was at TRA, Google was a client of TRA's. And I brought up the idea of random control trials. And they said, well, how can you do that in television? It's a linear, broadcast medium, and you're going to contaminate the control group because you can't stop those impressions from going wherever they go. I said, well, but Cablevision's got 3 million addressable homes. So we can control the control group. We can make sure they don't get any accidental impressions and we can do random control testing. So I introduced Ben Tata to Jim Dravilis, and we had some interesting meetings, but somehow never got there. Then Altice bought Cablevision, and the Dolans wisely carved out what had been the advanced advertising department and made it 605. And they have continued to do random controlled trials for their clients across media, digital and TV, using addressable TV so that you could control it. And logically, the viewer doesn't know it's addressable TV, it's TV. They don't know it's addressable. So theoretically, that's the solution. So January 24th of 2019, the ARF held a meeting at which Google, Netflix, Facebook, Pandora, Wayfair, Walmart, Sam's Club, and I'm missing some, a whole bunch of companies presented some fabulous random control trials. Beautiful stuff. There's a new invention. Randall Lewis had something to do with it, a lot to do with it. It's called ghost ads. I won't belabor the details of it, but it's a way of making it possible to do random control testing without having to pay for the placebo ads, which had always been one of the hangups that made random control less popular. So first, Jim Donius stood up and, based on his extensive experience, pointed out that left out price and promotion and television. So, and then I followed that up and said, leaving out television, you're really praying that you toss a coin and it lands on its edge, that the TV is going to fall perfectly the exact same way on both the test and control. It's not likely to happen. So you got to get TV in there. And they all said, you can't do it. We agree with you completely. And we agree with Jim Donius completely. Just, you can't do it. And then I said, but 605 is doing it. I can't say more about that right now, but there's stuff going on that will be announced soon that will be very exciting in terms of being able to measure incrementality. I wish I could say more.
It's an incredibly exciting time because brands can actually finally understand what's moving the needle for them. What's important to me, though, and what's fascinating is that you mentioned you're back in a startup again. So, what is it that drives someone at your tender age to want to do this over and over again?
Well, it gives you more flexibility. I like being more of an inventor and I guess a Johnny Appleseed, proselytizing new ways of doing things. That's more fun for me. But the driver tag thing is a real passion of mine. If you go back to my first, we you used to call them blue books at Interpublic. I worked for a division of Interpublic, which is kind of, well, this is mixing metaphors because I'm about to name a unit of Omnicom because it's popping into my head. Analect or Zaxis, it was more of an advanced data unit and it served all of the agencies within Interpublic. And so that unit, Applied Science Division, we got to do a lot of interesting work together. And the first blue book that I got to write, which is what they called them in those days, it's like a white paper, was what's the effect on commercial communication of the program environment on television? And I compiled, it was basically a meta analysis of Gallup and Robinson and Burke studies by agencies, including J. Walter and others. It was just trying to compile all the studies that had been done of context effects. And all of them had been based on program types. There was no other handle that you had on context other than program types. Later on, I did some work where I was using specials, and I was able to get data on specials versus regular series. But anyway, the blue book was all based on program types. And there was some consistency in the results. That is, if it was a food or beverage product, just like Horace Schwerin had said years earlier in radio, that if you put a food or beverage product commercial into a program that's fear producing, like a crime drama, the ad will be less effective. So comedies were a better place to go. And just 2 years ago, I think it was, Leslie Wood, in doing a meta analysis of the same kind of Nielsen Catalina data, over 1,000 different studies, she found exactly the same thing, that the way she put it was CPGs show something like a 10% average lift in comedies. And there were no other really significant findings when you looked at program types. But RMT doesn't look at program types. RMT looks at the individual DNA of each show. And it's based on work that Next Century Media did, where we started with 1,562 psychological meta tags that we put on shows. And then we saw that some of them were noise variables. They didn't predict program conversion after you made a recommendation. We found that 265 of them did predict program viewing after a recommendation, loyal program viewing, 3 out of 4 episodes. And those 265 became known as driver tags. We had been using driver tags just on helping Hollywood develop better pilots and stuff like that. But then Howard Schimmel said, what about ad context? And I said, oh my gosh, that's one of my favorite ongoing subjects. He said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I've got some Nielsen Catalina studies I've done. I know Nielsen Catalina, I've asked them, will retabulate them according to driver tag resonance. I'm going to send you some schedules for a couple of brands. And it turned out to be 2 brands that had between them 15 different creative executions. They were in almost 800 different programs, those ads, in a certain quarter across 77 networks. And our job was to provide a resonance score What percent of the driver tags in the ad were also in the program for each of the almost 800 units? And then Nielsen Catalina would see whether there was a relationship with sales lift. And they found a double digit relationship, positive relationship with sales lift. Then 605 did a study and found out that it worked with branding measures too. They found a 62% increase in first brand mention when the driver tags were resonant between the ad and the program. So now we're doing driver tags in digital for targeting and in addressable TV for targeting. We're doing it also for contexts in digital. You know, a lot of people are saying that the privacy movement is eventually going to make it so hard to deal with ID targeting that we're going to need to go back to context targeting in digital. And I want us to be ready for that.
So you bring up something important about the resonance score. So what you're saying is ad effectiveness is better or stronger when there's a better correlation between the driver tags and the branding and the driver tags that are in the content that the viewer is consuming.
Yeah, look at it in terms of there have been studies done which show that when the next incoming stimulus has a greater similarity with the previous incoming stimulus, the brain is 3 times faster in recognizing the information.
Taking that into context of what's going on today, publisher, especially on the digital side, is overwhelmed with coronavirus content. And brands, being smart, or you could say reactive, are immediately blocking every bit of coronavirus content. I think that's a mistake. People searching, it's very emotional. Branding is an emotional event. You wouldn't want to use your regular messaging, but do you think there's an opportunity for brands to pick up on the driver tags that are in the content that they're consuming right now with the news of the spread of the pandemic and then hook up creative that goes along with that? Is there an opportunity there?
An enormous opportunity. I hark back to a study I did and published in the Journal of Advertising Research in 2006, which showed that branded content, which isn't trying to sell a product, but it's brought to you sponsored by a brand, has 7 times the persuasion effect as the average 30-second TV commercial. Years ago, in my newsletter, I called it quality of life advertising. That so many brands are talking about product differences that the consumer doesn't believe really exist between brands in most categories. And they could be using that commercial time more powerfully by bringing something inspiring or entertaining or useful or informative, educational, uplifting in that 30 seconds rather than an ad. And it's brought to you by Bounty or whoever. And today, the opportunity to think back to the P&G Thank You Mom ads in the Olympics and picture ads that are about the heroes, the people who are doing the frontline research, people who are putting themselves in jeopardy in order to care for the ill. I think of them as wounded. I think of this as a war against a very tiny enemy. They're too small to see, but they're the enemy, and there's a lot of them. And they're attacking us. It's like a war. And in wartime, the advertisers that pulled back lost market share. And so this isn't a time to pull back. It's a time to bring in new messaging, uplifting, courage making. That's what they should be doing.
I agree 1,000%. I got to ask you about mind magic because this is a whole portion of your life that exists on a whole nother realm, but seems to also be in sync with your whole philosophy of work and life.
I had the luck to be born into a terrific family. My parents were just my idols. They're both gone now, and they were in showbiz. And so they told me when I was age 4 that I had to get on stage because we were a showbiz family. That's what we did. I was born in a trunk and so on. So I hated the idea. It scared me to death. And nevertheless, I did what they said. And I noticed after a while, as opposed to my robotic initial performances, I started to get into some other state of consciousness where I didn't think I was doing anything. It was kind of happening by itself. I was maybe up in the air behind myself, looking down at myself doing it. And I was getting big laughs. We were doing stand up, my father and I. I did some singing and dancing, but so I had discovered what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the former head of the psychology department at the University of Chicago, gave the name flow state. Other performers called it being on. In science, they call it the eureka or aha moment. But flow state, I didn't know what it was. I just knew that there was another state of consciousness. And I couldn't explain it to myself because I was a kid, but I spent a long time thinking about it. Turns out I was actually meditating, and I didn't know what that was either, but I was doing it. And so I spent a lot of my life that way. And then what I found was there were certain tricks, mind tricks, that worked. Like not jumping to conclusions, avoiding hasty closure. That's one of the chapters in Mind Magic, one of the 12 tricks that book is focused on. So I started to compile these tricks for myself. And then in my 30s, friends said to me, "Hey, you should publish this stuff. This is great. This works. I tried it. It works. You should publish it." So that became Mind Magic.
That's incredible. How long has it been? When was it published? And who's read it that we would know about?
Well, it was published in 76. It got quotes on the back cover from Ram Dass, Jimmy Carter. John Lennon didn't actually give me a quote. He just kept buying copies and giving it away to friends. It's been used as a course text at NYU, UCLA, West Point. Total of 34 universities have used it as a course text. Banks have used it, P&G's used it, human resource development.
Bill, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Any last words you want to leave us with, especially as we're moving into some interesting and uncertain times?
In a time of contraction, the first instinct is to cut marketing. And why? It's because marketing is perceived as being fluffier than the rest of the corporation. Like more unproven techniques are used, more shooting from the hip. I think all marketers should, right now, make a list of all their data sources and all of their systems and kind of rank them based on how proven they are against incrementality and hard measures of performance, real business outcomes, and get rid of the fluffy ones. Don't just let them cut everything equally. If it's going to be cut, at least cut out the fluff.
And most importantly, don't pull back because, as you said earlier, brands that pull back, they lose market share.
They're abandoning their constituencies when they should be supporting them at a time of emotional difficulty.
Excellent. Bill Harvey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.